So good morning or good afternoon. I am Nwando Obelli. I have the incredible privilege of being the Director of Learning and Evaluation at TSNE MissionWorks, and I am joined today by three phenomenal and fearless women who are just as committed to imbuing equity throughout their capacity building work, and that is Teresa Crawford, Emily Wexler, and Noor Chaudhry from Social Sector Accelerator. So thank you both for holding this space today. And thank you all for making time, especially given this moment, to be in this inclusive space of learning and reflection. So in today's conversation, we want to achieve three core objectives. So first and foremost, we want to give you an opportunity to wrestle with, to experience co-design or participatory design and human-centered design tools. We also want to invite you to be part of the tribe, a diverse group of nonprofit leaders, fiscal sponsors, capacity builders, intermediaries, individuals, and organizations, all committed to using co-design as both a way to have an inclusive and equitable process, as well as achieve equitable outcomes. And then lastly, we want to give you an opportunity to iterate and test some of these foundational co-design tools, okay? And so for today's agenda, after I wrap up this welcome and grounding, I'm going to hand it over to Teresa, who will just level set about what is participatory design, what is co-design. Teresa will also do the good work of being explicit about how co-design really does inform our equitable way of working. I'll then share a little bit as a mini case study about TSNE MissionWorks Learning Lab and how we've used co-design to better center those most impacted by our work. And then lastly, you all will have an opportunity to really wrestle with and experience these tools. So you'll be working in small groups in the Purpose to Practice worksheet. We'll be taking a mini break so you can take care of yourself and your loved ones. And then we'll be reconvening to practice the empathy mapping, doing some ideation through how might we. And then lastly, Teresa and I will be closing out with some additional resources and a call to action. So to do a quick tech check, I want to invite people, if you're not speaking, to please mute your mics. That way we can reduce the background noise and we can really actively listen and honor those who are speaking. And when you're ready to talk, you just unmute yourself and speak. We also would love to see your faces as a way, especially in this virtual conversation, to really be in this space together. However, if you're not comfortable, by all means, that's your decision. And if you're experiencing any internet connectivity issues, try just turning off your webcam and seeing if that helps. Lastly, we're also going to ask you to share your name, your organization, and your location in the chat. So please feel free to do so using the chat box. And then we will be zooming it up, as I call it. We'll be using breakout rooms and the chat and polls. And then lastly, we're going to invite you to update your title with your preferred font. So before I speak about TSNE MissionWorks mission and vision, I just want to honor the space that we are collectively in a community, in the nation, in the world, and just be clear about why we're having this conversation now. Why at this moment? And I think it's really crucial that as those who are dedicated to supporting our clients, our constituents, and our communities, that we be clear about our intention of imbuing our work with equity. So I want to just name and be explicit. This is beyond feedback. This is beyond listening tours. This is about how do we create an equitable process where we create inclusive spaces for those who are most impacted by our work to leverage their own power, to speak for themselves, to identify the needs, and to co-create solutions that work for them. And with that, I also want to share TSNE MissionWorks mission and vision, right? So our mission as an organization is that we are working to build the knowledge, the power and the effectiveness of individuals, organizations, and groups, right? And our ultimate intention is to create all of that, working to create a more just and democratic society. Our vision, what we aspire to in our everyday work, is we envision a society where community-based organizations take the lead in not just shaping their community's future, not just shaping their city's future, not just shaping their state's future, but shaping the country's future, so that these individuals can hold us and the systems that affect their everyday lives accountable. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Teresa.
Great, Nwanda, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. I loved watching the chats come in as you were talking, showing us the diversity of folks that are on this call, and from all over the country. We got a few folks in Canada, so thank you for making the time. So my name's Teresa Crawford, and I'm the executive director of an organization called the Social Sector Accelerator. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we work both in the United States and around the world with grant makers and capacity builders and intermediaries, helping them to really bring their vision and their values of their organizations in line with their practices and their processes in support of their partners and of the grantees that they work with. And from our inception, so we're about 5.5 years old, and going back to the early days of my career, everything that we've done has been imbued with elements of participatory design in it, because we were all schooled in the practices of organization and of individual change. Going back to the times of reading, Pedagogy of the Oppressed with Paulo Freire, saying, we don't learn unless we're all learning together, and that means the teacher is a learner, the student is a learner, the community is learning. And so this was something that we've always brought into our work. And so for us, participatory design is both a value. It's something that we hold ourselves accountable to, participation and engagement, as well as part of our process. So something that's imbued in everything that we do. And so if you hear the terms thrown around, you heard Nwanda say kind of 3 in a row: participatory design, co-design, human-centered design. They all are different elements of this way of thinking about working with all the people affected by, and really centering the people most affected when we're developing new programs, new projects, new services, to ensure that what we develop with them meets their needs and is really usable. So what we're going to be doing today is really talking about some of the elements of why that's so important to us. And I love this quote because it reminds us that yes, outcomes may be better. Yes, products may be better because of what the processes we're using, but equally important is the process itself that we're using to design those things helps to create patterns for relating across differences as equals. And so Audre Lorde really calls it out, where she says, when we're able to do that, those differences finally have a name and are celebrated and become part of creating connection. So no longer, misused to service separation and confusion, but instead creating opportunities for connection and for clarity. So you're going to hear this echoed throughout what we do over the next 2 hours together. One of the things that we've been wrestling with is, how do we know when what we're doing through our practices and our processes and our programs, how do we know that they are equitable? So how do we as an intermediary or a capacity builder, how do we know that what we're doing is equity informed? And a few of the things, and I invite you to drop into the chat any thoughts that you all have about how do you know what you're doing is equity informed. So it's creating space to cross lines of difference and share power. It helps us to move from sympathy, I'm sympathetic to what you're experiencing, to empathy, to, okay, how do we change that? What do we do different the next time? What's the harm that's been caused, and how do we need to then support you to remedy that? And it forces us to actionize that empathy, to move from just an ally to becoming I love Nwando's constantly like, ooh, we get to be co-conspirators together. We get to be actors together, and we need to be making change. We need to move from, oh, I recognize that as an inequitable practice, to, okay, I'm going to change that practice going forward. And it enables, both equitable process, which can't be disconnected from equitable outcomes. It brings those two closer together when we know that our practices are equity informed. So I'm curious, it's a little hard for me to monitor the chat at the same time while I'm presenting, but if anybody has a thought to share about, how do you know that a practice you have, whether it's a recruitment process or it's a selection process for participants in a program, or it's a curriculum development process. How do you know that those practices or processes are equity informed? So just, if they come to you while we're talking, drop those in the chat.
What we want to do is kind of undergird this conversation with participatory design as a way to support human-centered design practice. But as Nwando often says, you can have a human-centered design process that is not participatory. So while these things are related, they are not interchangeable. And so what we're going to be doing today and throughout the course of the remainder of our conversation together is really to try to situate the conversation about co-design in the sort of lexicon of human-centered design, while recognizing that co-design has to be a choice that we affirmatively choose at every step along the way. And so we'll dig into this map a little bit more explicitly at different points along the conversation, but this is going to be our roadmap for today. And so one of the things that we wanted to surface in this chat was, in this breakout room chat, about the intentionality with which we affirmatively choose a participatory or co-design process. And so we recognize we want to give more time for you all to talk, and we want to have some time to really dig into a mini case study, but we've surfaced some opportunities of where we've identified when to use participatory design. And so here are a couple ideas on the screen here around whether there's a disconnect between you and your end user. You're clear about when participation begins and ends. You're clear about why it matters and what is the ultimate purpose. What is this in service of, and how is this going to result in stronger programs and services, better, more equitable outcomes? So you have complete clarity around that, as well as when to not use it. And this is just as important, because I think one of the things we wanted to illustrate with the chat is that participatory design done in name only can cause harm. And so here are some instances when it is a sort of a red flag moment to say, this might not be the right time, or you might not be pursuing it for the right reasons. So if there's a lack of internal agreement or understanding about what the process entails, are there constraints that make sort of full inclusive participation possible? Is it a check the box? Is it tokenistic? Are there expectations clear for all stakeholders involved? And if the value of the participation is made clear. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Nwando to offer us a mini case study about sort of co-design in action. So Nwando, I will just be advancing the slides. You lead us through.
One moment, I still have the polling. One moment, let's see if I can.
Oh, sure.
There we go. Okay. So using the TSNE's Learning Lab and basing it off of the Purpose to Practice worksheet that was shared yesterday, I wanted to share about how TSNE mission works, how we're on our, what I call the forever journey towards equity, and how the Learning Lab is really helping us better understand and better support those we serve. So why is this work important, not only to TSNE, but to the larger community? And first and foremost, the Learning Lab aims to build our collective knowledge, right? Not by being experts, not by being credentialed, but through discovery and exploration of how to better meet the capacity building needs of under-resourced movements and coalitions and other grassroots groups, especially in a moment where a lot of these grassroots groups are supporting some of the nation's most vulnerable and marginalized and under-resourced communities. And so if that is our purpose, then we understand that that is really, involving grassroots leaders, capacity builders, fiscal sponsors, and donors and funders. So I just want to be clear. Yes, this is TSNE's strategic initiative, but we are really focused on having a larger dialogue with the sector. So what rules must we obey, right? What I'd like to just be clear about is the Learning Lab is really based very deeply in two core principles. Human-centered design encourages us to develop a deep empathy, to develop deep understanding of those we serve, while agile thinking is this really iterative planning approach that places people over process. And so when we think about human-centered design core principles, first and foremost, it's important to understand that people are experts in their own lives. And if you acknowledge that your clients, their constituents, that communities are experts in their own lives, you acknowledge that they have a level of knowledge and insights and experiences, right? You also acknowledge that you are not an expert in their lives. And because you understand that people are experts in your own lives, you're constantly pursuing gaining empathy for those that we serve. The third principle is one that is one of my favorites, which is despite our own expertise, if we acknowledge that people are experts in their own lives, that means that in your virtual offices, in your virtual meetings, you're making a lot of assumptions. And there's nothing wrong with assumptions, as long as we understand that those assumptions are limited. That if we genuinely want to be in partnership with our clients and our constituents, we need to acknowledge that we may not know a lot. Right? And that if we wanted to check our assumptions, then we have to go to those most impacted by our work, and those are our constituents. Human-centered design is also really explicit in promoting equity by challenging this very dominant knowledge we have in this sector around perfectionism, which is a manifestation of white supremacy. So in human-centered design, we don't pursue the perfect. We don't pursue the great. What we do is we acknowledge that there are limitations to some of the work that we're doing, that good enough may be what's most useful right here, right now. And so we're focused on innovating. We're focused on trying something, prototyping. We're focusing on testing it, whether that's through interviews or focus groups or creating something and then putting it in the wild and letting people use it. And when we gather all of that diverse feedback, we're dedicated to iterating it, and we do it over and over and over again. Agile thinking is really based in this very key principle of consistently delivering value to those we serve. It also is about keeping it simple and showing, don't tell. I know that in this sector, we love to create lots of documents. We love to create lots of reports. Well, if we really want to design a new capacity building initiative or to launch a new way of doing our work, rather than investing that time in creating these very superficial documents, let's actually create something. Let's create something and then have those that are impacted by our work use them. And once again, human-centered design and agile thinking collectively has been a really powerful, powerful principles in guiding the Learning Lab. So who is included? I always want to quote Representative Ayanna Pressley when she says, as I've always said, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And so I can acknowledge that the Learning Lab would not have been made possible by TSNE leadership. That's Elaine Ning, our fearless CEO, by funders and donors, by our fiscal sponsorship peers and partners, by social sector Accelerator and other brave capacity building partners. And yet at the core of what we do in the Learning Lab, it is constantly grounded and focused on our constituents and our community partners. And I want to be explicit. Once again, this is beyond feedback. This is beyond getting input. This is about creating inclusive spaces so that communities, community leaders, those that receive our services get to leverage their own power and be decision makers, to be genuine and authentic partners in moving our work forward. When we think about the Learning Lab and how we organize and distribute control, at its core, the Learning Lab, once again, uses a combination of human-centered design and agile project management. And in using these two very powerful concepts, we're disrupting traditional methods of community engagement and project planning. And once again, we're doing that by creating these inclusive spaces for those who are most impacted by our work to co-design and then also actionize effective solutions. And there's two primary ways in which we practice that through the Learning Lab. So the first way was actually having a learning board, right? So this is our learning board. It's a group of diverse and phenomenal and courageous women leaders. At the very top, we have 4 TSNE clients and constituents from all across the organization. We also invited 3 of our staff, and these are 3 line staff. We wanted staff who experienced and worked with and supported clients on an everyday basis. We were very explicit that management was not allowed to be on the board. So our learning board was really the governing body that helped decide the direction of the Learning Lab. The Learning Board was responsible for making meaning of data. We partnered with the NYU Metro Center to do research. And rather than that research sitting just with TSNE leadership, it actually went to the Learning Board, and we held collective meaning making sessions. The Learning Board was essential in helping us identify key learnings and share them. And most importantly, the Learning Board was foundational in helping us reimagine our services and our capacity building supports. So the Learning Board said, based off of all the research, based off of our lived experience in supporting some of the state's most vulnerable and under-resourced communities, these are the top 5 capacity building needs we need. And some of those capacity building needs were affordable technology, software, and hardware. Having affordable and equity-informed learning and evaluation supports so that you could capture not only the transactional impact, but the transformational impact as well, okay? They also mentioned governance, that traditional hierarchical governance does not work in a lot of coalitions and movements. They also said incubation supports. Because the sector is so obsessed with evidence-based practices, if you're sitting in your community and you find out a new way to support undocumented single homeless mothers, or you find out a new way to support homeless veterans, you don't want to spend years and years trying to have that be approved by a funder or some evaluator. They need incubation supports. It's a combination of both funds and capacity building supports to test whether that is a way to better support certain communities.
There's a question in the chat, Nwando, from Phyllis about how were learning board members selected. What was the process behind that?
That's a great question. So we had a blind process. So my partner, who I want to honor, Lilo Atali, who was the project manager for the Learning Lab, he and I worked together to create criteria based off our conversations with other grassroots leaders. And then we had a blind process where we invited our constituents and clients to come in to put their name in the hat, etc. For our staff, it was a similar process as well. So we used a combination of, having an open call as well as inviting selective people that we knew had a lot of deep experience with TSNE. That was our primary criteria. And then internally, we held the blind process for staff. Great question, Phyllis. Another way in which we think through how do we create an inclusive space of learning and reflection is by sprints, right? So traditional project management tells us that if you have a project or an engagement, you have a start, beginning, and end, right? And there's certain milestones and there's certain conversations, and it's very rigid and prescriptive. Well, being agile, we have 90-day sprints, and 90-day sprints are where we plan what we want to achieve in those 90 days. What are the learning questions we want to ask? What are the things we want to learn? Who are the individuals and the groups we want to be in conversation and dialogue with? We then go and we gather information. We then brought it back to our learning board for them to analyze that information, for them to ideate, and then we share it out. So this is what we've been doing for the past 2 years, is we've been doing these 90-day sprints. And I cannot stress how important it was to have 90-day sprints, especially when the pandemic and the recession hit, right? Because rather than saying, here's a year's worth of planning that we have to adjust, 90-day sprints allow us to be in the moment and to remain really responsive to a lot of the emerging needs that were coming from various communities, especially in April and May. Is there another question in the text box that just popped up? My apologies, I can't.
I was just about to answer for you since I know how this worked, but the question from Kathy was about, was it 90 days in total for everything you guys were doing, or was it 90-day increments over time? And it was increments over time, right?
Yes, it was 90 days for the last 2 years. So 90 days, 90 days, 90 days.
Exactly.
Thank you, Teresa. When we think about what are we going to do, right? So once again, co-design isn't simply about having an equitable process. It's about actionizing those learnings to achieve equitable outcomes. And here are some ways that we're pursuing that work. First and foremost is this conversation itself. We are hosting design labs. We'll be also hosting conversations in 2021 about how we can reimagine the way that we do fiscal sponsorship, or that we can reimagine the way that we do fund development for grassroots groups, or we can reimagine that governance is a function, not a structure. So what are the really innovative structures that are out there that are working for certain movements and coalitions? We are also working on holding feedback sessions. So those top 5 capacity building needs that our learning board created, we want to be in dialogue. We will be sharing them and hosting similar virtual sessions in 2021, where you are all invited to share your thoughts, your feedback, what's working, what's not working. We're also publishing research and case studies. So once again, we're not waiting till 2 years is over to share our learnings. If you visit the TSNE Learning Lab website right now, there's a lot of resources and research and best practices. We've also been in conversation with 4 peer fiscal sponsors who are also thinking through reimagining their work, who are thinking about how they can too better support these grassroots movements and coalitions to do their best work. We're also providing resources and toolkits. So we have the Human-Centered Design and Agile Thinking Toolkit for nonprofits that includes videos, instructional videos as well. And lastly, and I would say most importantly, we have been using the Learning Lab's learnings throughout the last 2 years to inform our strategic planning. So when we think about TSNE MissionWorks and the next 5 years of our strategic work, we're constantly drawing upon the Learning Lab. We're using the Learning Lab's learnings to guide our social impact investment strategy. So if we acknowledge that there are grassroots groups that desperately need our supports and can afford it, or that there are grassroots groups that need organizational development, but they need it in a more culturally competent and proficient way, what does that mean for a capacity builder like TSNE? And also we're using it constantly in our ongoing endeavors. So we're using it as we think through and redesigning our consulting, our training, our capacity, our other capacity building initiatives, as well as fiscal sponsorship.